So, welcome to Yiddish New York. I'm delighted to be part of it. I think I have participated in every single one, and this year's program is outstanding. And so today, and of course, I'm Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, as you know from having signed up for the session. What I'd like to do today is to share with you my journey, my adventure in collecting cookbooks, in collecting Jewish cookbooks, in collecting Yiddish cookbooks, and to pose a set of questions that will place these cookbooks within a wider history of Jewish cookbooks. So let me start by saying a few words about my collection. Then I'm going to do a little bit about the history of these cookbooks, and then I'm going to share some very specific and wonderful gems in my collection. So I should start by telling you that I am an inveterate collector. I collect all kinds of things. I collect rubber stamps, I collect nutcrackers, sieves, graters, books, of course, and cookbooks. And my interest in cookbooks actually begins in childhood because I had a particular interest in cooking from a very young age. But also I began collecting by clipping the coupons from Better Homes and Gardens and other magazines for free cookbooks for products, gold medal flour, Crisco, whatever it might be. I love to get mail, and it was a great way to get mail. So my first cookbooks were number one, the textbook for the home economics class in my public school in Toronto during the 1950s, and then these free cookbooks. Then when I really became seriously interested in cookbooks and started collecting them, I found that this was a fool's errand, that there are so many cookbooks that I needed to focus. I didn't have the resources as a student, as a graduate student, to simply collect cookbooks in general. So I thought I'll collect Jewish cookbooks. Well, but that turned out to be also enormous. So I thought, well, I'll collect Yiddish cookbooks because that's surely a small category. And being a small category, I would be able to collect a few very special, precious ones. And with limited resources that I had, I would be able to buy them. So then I found that one of the most interesting ways to collect, and a way to collect that was even more focused, was to collect multiple editions of a single cookbook. So when you look at my shelves, I have, a whole shelf just of the settlement cookbook. Pardon me. I have just multiple editions of different Jewish cookbooks, and they turn out to be extremely interesting. And I'm going to share some examples with you. But before I do that, what I want to do is to pose a set of questions that are, for me, really puzzling questions, because cookbooks are, on the one hand, everybody asks, have you read them all? No. Well, I've dipped into them, but have I actually read them all? Not from cover to cover. Have you cooked from them all? The answer is also no. So then why collect them? Well, I collect them, first of all, in a way, it's the wrong question, because a library is really all about potential, about what I might find and all the surprises that I find, and where I might go and look for something that I need. So I would say that it's not about reading them all, cooking from them all, using them all. It's rather about the potential that they offer. That's the first thing. The second is that cookbooks are more than recipes. They're actually artifacts. They are an extraordinary resource for understanding the history of Jewish women, of domestic life, and of the wider milieu in which they operated. And you have to know how to read them. You have to know how to work with them. And so it's in that spirit that I'd like to present to you the gems from my collection, particularly the Yiddish ones, but also something about the history within which they sit. So I want to start with, a set of questions. So first of all, I would say, Jewish cookbooks they develop in the 19th century, and the earliest one is 1815, and in German. And the earliest ones are all in German, and they are 19th century. So one of the questions is, why did they arrive so relatively late because the cookbooks in other languages are already being published in the 1700s, in the 18th century. So the Jewish cookbooks are considered to be a relatively late phenomenon. And in fact, they don't really take off until the second half of the 19th century. So the question is why? Why are they so late? That's the first question. The second question is, most of the ones in other languages, at least the early ones, are written by men. And most, if not all, of the early Jewish cookbooks are written by women, although there is an exception in the case of the Yiddish cookbooks. And that's another issue as to why are the Yiddish cookbooks and the one cookbook that is presumably, but I think it's debatable, in German in Hebrew letters, why are those by men? So that would be another question. Then yet another question is, which is a really baffling one, because the first Jewish cookbook to appear in Hebrew letters appears in Hungary, and it appears in 1854. Now, why is anybody publishing a Jewish cookbook, presumably in German, although I think this is debatable, but presumably in German, very German, in Hebrew characters? Who's it for? Why? And then last is I have a wonderful, fascinating Yiddish cookbook that I'll present to you that is a translation from a French cookbook that is addressed to highly Polonized women in Yiddish. Why? So these are some conundrums having to do with the history and publication of Jewish cookbooks that hopefully we can discuss, when we have the opportunity to open the floor, so to speak, to discussion. So first, let me start with the very first published Jewish cookbook that we know of. And it is probably, in all likelihood, it is the first. So 1815, that is super early. It is by Joseph Stoltz. Now, Joseph Stoltz was a Catholic. And interestingly, he was the personal chef of the Grand Duke in the state of Baden. Now, how does the chef to the Grand Duke in the state of Baden come to write a Jewish cookbook? And it is the title, and I'll give you the title basically in English, and that is Cookbook for Jews, so not Jewish cookbook, Cookbook for Jews, or Practical Instruction for Preparing All Kinds of the Finest Dishes According to the Jewish Dietary Rules. So in other words, it is absolutely classic for the 19th century Jewish cookbooks, and that is it's kosher gourmet, or what I would call invisibly kosher. In other words, you can prepare what he calls the finest dishes, and they can be absolutely kosher. And in consuming them or presenting them or with your guests or whatever, their kosherness is not visible. It's simply kosher. Now, how did he do this? He explains his purpose in creating this cookbook. He says, as far as I know, no similar book of this kind has been available for the followers of the Mosaic faith. Well, that's also interesting, that because these are these are Germans of the Mosaic faith. In other words, all that distinguishes them from their neighbors is religion. So in other words, they're identified by their religion, but they are clearly acculturated. They are acculturated in terms of the use of the German language, because by 1815, already Yiddish Western Yiddish would have been less used, although it's not gone, it's less used. German would be the language of a Jewish elite. And of course, this aspiration to create the finest dishes and that kosher is no impediment would also be a sign of acculturation. And it would be in the spirit of embourgeoisement, becoming bourgeois and being able to deliver this bourgeois sensibility and culture and aesthetics at the table. So he says, so no similar book of this kind has been available for the followers of the Mosaic faith, but, and for this reason, and for trying to be useful to many, I gladly acquiesce to the frequently repeated invitation of educated Jews. So this is his way of referring to what I'm calling acculturated Jews. So these are educated Jews, or another way one might put it, enlightened Jews, and decided to let my manuscript be printed. So he apparently had, at the request of his must be his Jewish associates or colleagues or friends, acquaintances, he must have prepared a manuscript of recipes at their request. Now, then he goes on to explain further. I mean, this is the first published Jewish cookbook by this incredible chef. He goes on to explain, as much as possible, constantly wishing to perfect myself in my trade, I gladly use the opportunity offered to observe the art of cooking in the houses of the most educated local Jews. What is he doing in those houses? How does he get there? And why? And he's observing how they're cooking. I mean, assuming that we can believe him, that's extraordinary. Then he says, and after becoming thoroughly familiar with its practice, I decided to improve certain things in the Jews' method of cooking. And then he explains how he makes German haute cuisine kosher. The parts of dishes and ingredients which don't conform to the Mosaic laws, or only at certain times, I substituted other kinds so that the whole dish should be not only healthy and pleasing to the digestive organs, but at the same time, it should also conform in matters of taste to the requirements of the finer art of cooking. So now what's so interesting is that we know from later, not that much later, but later examples of this kind of cookbook, which I call kosher gourmet or invisibly kosher. We know that some of those cookbooks, the motivation was to ensure that the socially aspiring, upwardly mobile bourgeois Jewish women, and particularly young brides, and those who would cook for them, would not abandon kashrut in order to be able to cook this haute cuisine, this European, and calling it German isn't quite right, but this, I would say, European haute cuisine, which means that it's German, it's French, it's Italian. It represents fine dining, basically, fine cuisine. But in his case, he says he's wanting to improve what Jews are already cooking in their kitchens. Now, what he's doing in their kitchens, I have no idea. But I have a feeling that in this small place where he is operating, he was living in Karlsruhe, where there were 670 Jews. And a year later, in 1816, he published another cookbook for Christians, and he included all the same recipes that he had in the Jewish cookbook. But it's a much bigger one. It had in it basically 616 recipes, where the Jewish one only had 344. So this is really, I would say this is completely out of the box. This is a completely exceptional cookbook going forward. So then there's the next one. The next one, and now we're already more in what I would call the sort of classic Jewish cookbook of the 19th century, and that is Rachel Ashman's 1835 cookbook, and its title is Tested Cookbook for Jews, based on her many years of experience. So now we have a woman who is an experienced Jewish cook. She might have been a caterer. She might have worked as a cook in a well-to-do household. And it was published in 1835. And what's so interesting is that in these very early Jewish cookbooks, there are no instructions for keeping kosher. There's an assumption that those who are buying the cookbook in the first half of the 19th century, they already know how to keep kosher. What they don't know how to do is to prepare fine or haute cuisine that is kosher. So they don't need to be told how to keep two sets of dishes and not to mix milk and meat and how to kosher meat, etc. That they know. But what they don't know is how to prepare these gourmet dishes. And so, but the many years of experience, I think, already tells you that there are women who are, if you will, professional cooks, and not just, amateurs. Later, we have some amateurs that really publish one cookbook, and that's it. Now, one of the most interesting, and here I'm really indebted to Andras Kovac, a Hungarian food historian, specifically on the history of Jewish food in Hungary. And he is writing currently a book about some of these the earliest Jewish cookbooks in Hungary. Very, very interesting book. And Eve Joknowitz drew my attention to the earliest, I think she would say the earliest Yiddish cookbook, but he says the earliest, if you will, Jewish cookbook in the German language in Hebrew letters. And we can, the issue of the language of German Jews in the 19th century, well, actually between the second half of the 18th century and up to 1914, the language of German Jews is much, much more complicated as to whether they're speaking Yiddish or Judeo-German or German and writing in German and Hebrew characters. It's much more complicated than that. And Steve Lowenstein has written a fascinating article about it. But let's look for a moment at this 1854 Hebrew lettered German cookbook, which I think came out in one edition. And these ones before, I would say before 1853, these early ones, the Stolz, the Aschheim, this one, they basically come out in one edition and then they disappear. That's an interesting question. So why are they in one edition? Why don't they have any legs? Why does there not seem to be any market for them? And my argument is that they are, that is, those who are publishing them are taking advantage, or if you will, are inspired by the success of non-Jewish ones, and they're publishing them not to meet demand, but to create a market for these cookbooks. And it might just be too early, or there may be, of course, be other reasons. But let's look at this incredible Hebrew lettered German cookbook, 1854. So here is its title in English. A new and complete cookbook. Well, we can argue about how new and how complete, but any event, a new and complete cookbook of the Jewish cuisine, an indispensable handbook for Jewish women and daughters, with instructions for koshering meat and separating challah, as well as for general cleanliness and kashrut. Well, I would say that that's the first of these Jewish cookbooks that is not assuming that the reader of the cookbook actually knows how to do all those things. So that's the first point. That I think is really interesting. The second is that it's 78 pages. This is hardly complete compared with the cookbooks that come out after it, and even the ones that came out before it. I mean, even the ones before it were like over 300 recipes. So 78 pages. Okay. Now, in 1854, when this cookbook came out, the publisher was one of the best known publishers of Hebrew prayer books and other religious literature, and his business went back to the 18th century. Now, what's so interesting is that this cookbook doesn't have an author on the front page. In fact, it's the publisher. Well, what happened is that these booksellers saw an opportunity to become publishers. So they went from being booksellers to being booksellers and publishers. And in this instance, this publisher is the, if you will, editor author of the cookbook. And presumably somebody in his office, in his business, might have been the actual editor, but essentially it's the publisher that is the author. Now, it's clear that there's nothing new about this cookbook in the sense that the recipes had been translated or copied, and he says so. He even says so, of course, without permission, from other cookbooks. And at this time, this this pilfering of recipes from previous cookbooks was really standard practice, especially in the case of Jewish cookbooks. And here's what he says. He's completely forthright. He says, in the present small cookbook, he acknowledges that it's not one of the big ones. I tried to collect the best, healthiest, and tastiest dishes, as well as their methods of preparation from the latest and best cookbooks. So it is derivative. And what we know, and then he also, he also says about the purpose of the cookbook, he says, therefore, I intended this work written in an easy and understandable style for my nation's previously mentioned gender, and I suggest to all women that they should use it frequently and diligently. So easy and understandable style. Now, my colleague, Andras, he says that he thinks that the women, that the readers for this cookbook, the women who would buy this cookbook, might have had difficulty reading German in Gothic script. So what I don't understand is that if it's Hebrew letters, it means that they know how to read Yiddish. It's not going to be because they are so fluent in Hebrew. I really, my sense is that they are reading Yiddish. If they're reading Yiddish, why doesn't he publish it in Yiddish? Well, of course, it's much easier, pardon me, it's much easier for the publisher, to not translate the German, but just render it in the Hebrew letters. So for me, it's very, very puzzling exactly what's going on here. So is it that it's easier for them to read Yiddish than German, but it's easier for him to present German rather than a Yiddish translation? Or maybe he thinks they're so close that it doesn't matter, that it is, to all intents and purposes, it would be like reading Yiddish, which I rather doubt. Now, fascinating is that in these early cookbooks, with a few exceptions, which I think Aschheim is the exception, but Stolz, and in the case of this one, the 1854 one, there are no Jewish dishes. Because why would there be Jewish dishes? The whole point of it is to do haute European cuisine. Now, but what there is, and this is not because this has nothing to do with Jewish food, but it has to do with, if you will, the cuisine of the period. There are recipes for liver, lungs, brain, sweetbreads, spleen, tongue, and even tripe. And these are not what you would expect in Jewish cookbooks that we get today. Although I must say, I know all of those. The only offal that I don't remember from my childhood would be tripe, but everything else: tongue, spleen, sweetbreads, brains, liver, lungs, beef cheeks, and also kidney. I don't remember kidney, but there are recipes for kidney in these cookbooks as well. Now, it turns out that more than half of the recipes, 140 out of 242, come from a cookbook that was published in 1840, which is the earliest Jewish cookbook published in Hungary and published, of course, in Germany. So it's really lifting like whole hogs, pardon the expression, lifting so much of this material, from an earlier cookbook. So with that, what I'd like to do is to turn to, but I should say that between Aschheim and this cookbook in Hebrew letters, there is, of course, the Julie Love cookbook of 1840, and just for its title, The Thrifty Jewish Cook. So they're trying to differentiate itself. Now it's The Thrifty Jewish Cook, or a new and complete cookbook for Jews, and it is indispensable handbook for hospitable women and daughters. So clearly for guests, I would say, and usually they have wedding menus. So the intention is that if you want to cook for an occasion, that you don't want to cook your normal cooking, you want to have sort of interesting new dishes. So what I want to do now is turn to some highlights from my collection in our journey across the world of Jewish cookbooks. Now, the single most successful 19th century Jewish cookbook, the single most successful, which is why I was able to collect it, where to collect the Stolz, the Aschheim, the Love, or the Hebrew letter cookbook is just about impossible. As far as the Hebrew letter cookbook, for a long time, nobody thought it was extant, and it was discovered or found in the Rosnatelia Library in Amsterdam, so far as we know, a single copy. So collecting those, the best I can do is microfilm, Xerox, digital scan, something on that order. But when it comes to Rebecca Wolf, I have hit gold. So 1853. So this is, I would say, the onset really of Jewish cookbook publishing, of Jewish cookbook, I would say a market for them. And it's very, very successful. So 1853, the title, Cookbook for Jewish Women, comprising the most various sorts of cooking and baking, and it goes through 14 editions between 1853 and 1933. And it was translated first of all, into Polish and into Dutch, and to some degree also into Yiddish. Now, this is, from my point of view, this is really, I would say, this really shows why it really is valuable to collect all the editions. So first of all, let me just show you from my collection. Now you can see, I think here, I'll do it. You can see sort of, from the style of dress. Also, I love, how much you can learn about stoves and cooking utensils and the like from these in terms of just the history of the kitchen. And then updated covers, clearly, and in this case, it looks like a professional chef. And this is obviously the servant girl. This is not the woman of the house. And then when we get to the 20th century, then, we don't have those kind of women's images. We have something altogether different. And then what we get is, which I think is really absolutely fascinating, is that I am now buying, because I buy all editions, I am now buying something called the Classic Reprint series, and that is from a website called forgottenbooks.com. And oh my gosh, I have a 1-month membership with unlimited access to over 1 million titles. They have basically been, what they've done is they've created facsimile editions, not always from the best copy and not always complete, but hey, I collect all the editions, so good, bad, or indifferent, I've got them. Now, of course, the editions that are closest to my heart are the ones that were in Polish, and then the Außer Blostein in Yiddish. So the earliest translation, and you can see how popular it must have been, the earliest translation is from 1877. 1877. Now, this is fascinating. Look at the title, Polska Kuchnia Koszerna, Polish cooking, Polish cuisine, Polish kitchen, kosher. In other words, the Polish kosher kitchen. Now, there's nothing Polish about this book. It was published in German. Now, of course, it reflects European Ashkenazi cuisine, and there are many, many things in this cookbook that were cooked by Jewish women, Jews also, presumably also in Jewish restaurants by men, but let's say Jewish women. There are many, many dishes here that were cooked in Poland. However, it is not it's not Polish cuisine. Kosher, yes, but not Polish cuisine. But I think the idea somehow, I think what it's doing is it's trying to localize this German cookbook, and also in Polish, you don't want to refer to Jews by the Polish word Żyd, Żydów. You would say Israelite. You say that in German too, because somehow or other, Jude, Juden, Żyd, they sound ugly. And also even in Juif, in French, the preferred word would be Israelite, or some other form. But in this case, this is a kind of a localizing of this cookbook. Then, and of course, I only have the reprints, but what I would kill to get the originals. Then it reappears in 1904 in a second edition, which I think is really, really interesting. But this time, the title is changed. Now it's simply Kuchnia Koszerna. It doesn't say Polish. It just simply says kosher cuisine. And because it's in Polish, the presumption is that it is Polish. But it's got kluski, and also what's so fascinating with the translation is to see from the vocabulary what these dishes are called in German and what they're called in Polish. And then there are further, so these are both these ones are both facsimiles of the 1877 and 1904 facsimiles of those early translations. But this book continues to appear in editions of the last few years. And in this case, it's Kuchnia Żydowska. Now it's, so you had Polska, then you had just Kosherna, and now they're actually owning up that it's Jewish. And what's more, it doesn't say kosher because it's addressed to a general audience that's more interested in Jewish cooking than they are in, if you will, in other words, this is for a non-Jewish audience. These other ones are for a Jewish audience that is either, and I would say if they're using a cookbook, they're probably quite acculturated and also socially aspiring or upwardly mobile. So Polish is much more prestigious, and that it's kosher is a kind of an indicator that we're dealing with acculturation rather than what I would call full assimilation. But in this case, this is for a Polish audience, and they don't care if it's kosher. They're interested in that it's Jewish. That's what they're interested in. And in this one, it says, opracowała Barbara Adamczewska. In other words, she's reworked it. And I can tell you, it is considerably shorter, fewer recipes. And I would imagine, that there is a focus more on, if you will, recipes that are more identifiably Jewish than generally European. So, and there are many. This is only one example of these recent ones. So then, what I find extraordinary is this is a Yiddish cookbook, Vilna, 1896. Published also in New York in 1898. And of course, there's a huge market in New York, although I don't think that the immigrant Jews that arrived between 1881 and 1914 would in and of themselves be a huge market. But to the degree that they're a market at all, they're a market in Yiddish. That would be for sure. Not in German, in Hebrew letters, not in Polish, but definitely in Yiddish. So this is Euser Blaustein. And this is really quite an extraordinary cookbook. And what he said, well, first of all, who was he? So who was this guy? Because most of these cookbooks are by women. So he basically is a Russian teacher and writer, born in 1840, died in Warsaw in 1899. So just after the New York edition came out. His Russian grammar was recommended for Jewish schools by the Ministry of Public Instruction. He also was the author of a book called German Method. So the guy is multilingual, and he's obviously reached German. So he could easily have read these German cookbooks, plus, of course, Polish and Russian. And he translated into Russian the Hebrew prayer book, the Machzor. He wrote novels of various kinds. So basically, the first edition subtitle states that the cookbook contains recipes from different cooking and baking styles from regions where the author lived in for many years. So I would imagine, that's actually from Rebecca Wolf. That is, she says that she lived in these various regions in a number of years and that her book represents the different styles, but it's from that cookbook that Euser Blaustein derives many of the recipes that appear in the Yiddish cookbook published in Vilna. Now, what I would say is that I consider the Blaustein book the first bona fide Yiddish cookbook. It is really the first, and we don't see it until 1898. I think that was the date, 1898 in Vilna, and then shortly thereafter in New York. So that's one story. That's a story of I would say, from the 1850s in German to the 1870s and early 1900s in Polish, also a Dutch edition, Dutch translation, and then in Yiddish in 1898. And it's not only from the Rebecca Wolf, but clearly it having appeared in Polish as well, of course, in these multiple editions in German and being so successful, it was clearly a source. So let me take another example, and then I want to go to my most recent acquisition, which just blew my mind. So now at the far end of at the other end of the spectrum. So one end of the spectrum is what I call kosher gourmet. So essentially fine dining that is kosher, with or without instructions for how to keep a kosher household, and with or without specifically Jewish dishes. I think as time went on, there would be a special section for Pesach, and there would be even either Jewish dishes tucked in or even a separate section on Jewish specialties. But overall, by and large, there was the assumption that, certainly in the early ones, that women knew how to keep kosher. They don't need to be told. And they didn't buy this cookbook in order to make matzah balls. They bought it in order to make, classic, I would say, European haute cuisine. Now, at the other complete end of the spectrum is this one. And this is 1929. This was the only edition I could afford. I mean, I would love to have bought it with its original covers, its original jacket, etc. But unfortunately, the price for this is like so astronomical. So what is it? It's Gastronomie Juive, Cuisine et Pâtisserie. Then, as you can see, it says kosher, but only in Hebrew letters. So it means that it really is invisibly kosher, because only if you can read the Hebrew do you know what it says. And then it goes on to say de Russie, d'Alsace, Roumanie et d'Orient, which means basically Tunis, Algeria, and Egypt. Very French, given the French colonies and given the French relationship to North Africa. Now, and it's by Suzanne Rochamovsky, and that's her married name. I think her original name is Bloch. Let me just check. And she is actually kind of a novelist, and she, just a second, I have her here. Yes, so she is a novelist. Her maiden name is Bloch. She's a poet, an essayist, and she is, I would say, a romantic. Something sentimental, nostalgic. And this is nostalgia par excellence. This is pure nostalgia. This is not about how to create fine haute cuisine that is kosher. This is all about the lost Jewish foods that I would say this is all about the cuisine that was lost to modernity. This is all about traditional Jewish dishes in these various countries that were part of a traditional Jewish kitchen, but that somehow it's now that modernity, now that the modernizing process has been so successful, it is safe to be nostalgic, and it is safe to be sentimental about this old school cuisine, this traditional cuisine. And I have the feeling that this is already in the category of a book to read, but not necessarily to cook from. Now, of course, you could cook from it, and no doubt people did, but it came out in exactly one edition, small format, with an introduction that is pure nostalgia and that sets the entire book in the backwaters of Galicia, meaning the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that was in the Austrian Empire, and that was given became a province, and that was called Galicia, and that was considered to be the, if you will, a relic area, a place where customs were preserved, not local customs, but also Jewish. And so the whole introduction is this very sweet, I would say even sappy, little ode to little David, who was so clever and so good at the cheder, and then this young couple, and they're learning to cook, and that's the spirit of it. Now, so what's actually in it? To give you a sense of the repertoire that you would find if you were to open up this cookbook. Oh, and also what she has to say about it, which I think is absolutely fantastic. So here's how she explains her goal in writing this cookbook. She says, the reader does not have to search here for quasi-pharmaceutical complications of a cuisine that is too modern, nor the royal luxury of truffles foie gras, and champagne that one freely adds to all sauces, at least in the books. In other words, she is taking a critical attitude. She is objecting to these cookbooks that are all about haute cuisine, whether they're general cookbooks, whether they're Jewish cookbooks. She's saying, no, those are quasi-pharmaceutical complications, which I, think is quite and truffles, foie gras, champagne. Then, so what's actually in here? Soup with hard-boiled eggs is the first recipe. That's for Pesach. That's salt water with hard-boiled eggs. I have no idea why she would start the section on Russian cuisine, which is the single biggest section in the whole book. Cold beet borscht, chav, tomato borscht, hot beet borscht, cabbage borscht, fresh one, sauerkraut one, stuffed cabbage one, pickles, gefilte fish, and I love page 41. Buy a live carp, and then she gives you instructions for how to kill it. And then stuff the slices, which my mother used to do, actually. Pacha, cholent, how to make sauerkraut, simmis, lokshen, farfel, mandlin, kreplach, nedlach, halkalach, pierogi, latkes, varenikis, kugel, keglach, homontage, and raisin wine, povedel. And then recipes from Alsace, for kugel, for kremslach, from Germany, mainly cakes and desserts, from Romania, goulash, gevech, stuffed eggplant, zucchini, and something called Oriental, meaning Tunis and Egypt are the main ones. Now, if I recall correctly, Reza Kalafovich found a Yiddish cookbook, which when I eventually paid a fortune, an absolute fortune, to buy it. And this is it. It is amazing. Die Jiddische Kuch, and by Base Shafran from Verlag Gastronomia, Warsaw. It is from a year later, 1930. And on the title page, it expands. It says, Die Jiddische Kuch in alle Länder. And this time it starts with Poland. It doesn't start with Russia. The other one doesn't mention Poland. Polen, Russland, Romanian, Deutschland, Elsass, Morocco, Tunis, America, und so weiter. So he's actually added a section. So at first, I thought, this is really fascinating. This is absolutely fascinating. And I looked further, and what I found, which I thought was just absolutely amazing, was there were, well, first of all, it looked familiar to me. I couldn't place it. But then I had a look inside, and I saw illustrations that were very reminiscent. And there's another one here. They were very reminiscent of illustrations that I saw here in this one. So just a second. And they're identical. So I thought, this is really strange. And I read the introduction. Well, the introduction is just astonishing. Absolutely astonishing, because here you have a Yiddish cookbook translated from the French one, which starts with this sappy, sweet little David in Galicia, and and has the Shabbos candles and stuff like that. Here, first of all, this is completely pirated edition. This one, his introduction, is a completely new introduction, and in it, he admonishes Polonized Jewish women. He says, how dare they turn the health of their families over to servants rather than pursue the culinary arts themselves? Christian women, he pointed out, are more attentive to the care of their families. And then in a section called A Word to Our Jewish Wives, he reports a conversation he ostensibly heard between two young ladies. I am certain he made this up, but in any event, this is the conversation. You have absolutely no idea, Sabina explained one to the other with a certain pride, how much I hate the kitchen, how much I can't stand it, so much so that I never set foot in it. Kill me if I know how to cook a little cereal or a pot of potatoes. And you think I'm better, responded the koleżanka, so a very Polish word from her, her friend, her girlfriend, coquettishly. A month ago, my Leon had terrible stomach problems. The doctor ordered him on a diet, and he had to have gruel. It says Cleicas. He had to have gruel prepared for him. Just his luck, the servant also fell ill, and I, let it never be said, had to be the cook myself. No, don't ask what kind of Cleicas I cooked. So then Saffron goes on to explain. Outside of Poland, a girl gets a diploma in public school and takes examinations in the culinary arts. So it should be among us. And he offered his cookbook as a step in that direction, notwithstanding its focus on down-home cooking and the inclusion of North African Jewish dishes. Now, what is this? I am completely, totally, and utterly baffled. Why? First of all, these highly Polonized Jewish women, if you want to reach them, why would you write in Yiddish? What are the chances that if they're so Polonized and they refer to koleżanka, etc., what makes you think they're going to read Yiddish? So that's the first thing. The second is, why this cuisine? I mean, presumably, if they're going to cook for their husbands and they're so Polonized, they're going to be much more interested in the Rebecca Wolf cookbook, which already exists. It already exists. Okay, 1907, it's a long time ago. By that time, it's out of print, and probably nobody remembers it, and this is already 1930. But in 1930, to publish these old school, super old school recipes in Yiddish for highly Polonized women, that is a complete and total and utter mismatch. So for me, this is a huge conundrum. I understand about Rebecca Wolf. I understand how it's translated into Polish. I understand even the differences in the titles. I don't get the cookbook in, quote, German and Hebrew letters, and I don't get this one in Yiddish. In a Yiddish translation, he's going to translate it already. He might as well have translated it into Polish, and he would have known how. So now I want to conclude with my latest treasures. And what happened was I spoke about my collection some time ago for POLIN Museum's Yiddish food festival, Tish, their Yiddish food festival. And on that occasion, a colleague of mine that I'd known from graduate school, so that goes back, 40 years, he contacted me and he said that he moved into an apartment and the woman who owned the apartment had died and had left behind a whole cache of stuff. And he said, would I be interested? And I said, sure. So here's what came. I can't believe it. So first of all, it's from Helen's Kitchen. So who was Helen? So as far as we know, what he says is this. This is really wonderful, Barry O'Neill. He says, my impression is that this material is from the 1930s and 40s. When I bought my house here in LA 20 years ago, the woman who moved out left tons of her stuff behind, including this. She moved to an apartment in her beloved Las Vegas. Now, what he says about her, that there's not much information, but he says it's Helen Lulo, died at the age of 95, survived by a son and daughters. And so that's all we know. That's all we know about her. But although I'm really now tempted to contact her descendants to find out more about her. So we're in Helen's Kitchen. Now, it came with what I presume is a kitchen magnet, Ben Gurion. So I have a few little items from her kitchen. It came with this very strange trivet. And of course, this is from my bagel collection. But what came, which is so astonishing, I thought I died and went to heaven, was my first and only Yiddish manuscript cookbook. And this is astonishing. So obviously, and it's clear she must have started, or at some point, she was doing it in a notebook. But then at a certain point, she got herself a ring binder and she started to fill it up. And she filled it up with a combination of handwritten recipes, but also clippings from the Yiddish press. So this would be very typical, and sometimes with notes. So it's and there's a lot of loose material here, so I want to be very careful in trying to show it to you. But here it is. So you've got handwritten in Yiddish and clippings from the Yiddish press. Now, it's not only from the forwards, but it's from these cooking columns at the time. And it's clear, I mean, she must have been a very avid and, very enthusiastic cook. And it seems that I would love to have been at her place for Pesach, because it seems that Pesach was really important to her. And what we have is the 1930 Batamta Yiddish Mecholim. This is Tempting Kosher Dishes. About this, we could write a whole book from Manischewitz. We have also this one says that it is the second enlarged edition, but of course, in comparison with this, it doesn't, I mean, at least in its physical quality, it doesn't seem to do that. And then she even, cut out the side of the box from the matzah meal. And of course, she also has from Planters Peanuts, because all of these product companies saw there was an opportunity to market to the Jewish consumers and to market for Pesach, because I don't know, my mother used to always use peanut oil for Pesach. Presumably because it's not from corn or from other things that might be questionable for Pesach. In any event, so she has, and then she's got a ton of other sort of clippings and whatnot for Passover, but not only for Passover. Now, I want to say a word about this cookbook by way of conclusion. This is one of my favorites. So it's 1930, and what is so astonishing about it is that it is. Oh, and she's made notes in, like, how precious is that? She's actually made her own handwritten notes. I mean, I don't, I have to find out more. Did she have a big family? I mean, but this is a woman who was cooking. She was definitely cooking. So if you open it from the right, it's all in Yiddish. You open it from the left, it is all in English. Now, what is the assumption? The assumption is that there are two generations that are going to be making everything, or should be, or could be, or should be inspired to make everything and anything all year long from matzah. That's the basic assumption. That the mother, born in the old country, is going to read the Yiddish recipes, and the daughter, born or at least raised and educated in America, is going to make the recipes from the English side. I don't think they're necessarily cooking together, but it's like killing two birds with one stone, you'll pardon the expression, and that you have a book that will function for these basically two generations. And it is an attempt to mainstream matzah. I mean, why confine matzah and matzah meal to Pesach? Why not all year long? And if you're going to cook it all year long, you're not going to make matzah bray all year long. You're not going to make chremslech all year long. What are you going to make with matzah? So let me give you some suggestions and see what would appeal to you. So we have here farfel muffins. We have of course, all kinds of cakes. But then we've also got cheese blintzes, a root beer cake. We've got, let's see, some of the better ones. Oh, yes. We've got asparagus wheel, baked cucumbers. We've got a cheese pie, cream puffs. We have, let me see here. I think that there is some kind of stuffed green peppers, vegetable cutlets, mock sausage, fried cauliflower, salmon loaf, tuna fish pudding. We have baked stuffed fish and toasted cheese matzahs, matzah and cheese sandwiches. We have, so we actually have quite a selection. Mock sausage. Oh yes, one of my favorites, Josephine pie. And other featured dishes are waffles, muffins, strawberry shortcake, pancakes, and of course, the story of the Manischewitz bakery, the Manischewitz baking factory itself. So I think that, and also what I think is fascinating too is, all right, these ones are the Manischewitz are pretty straightforward, but I think you get a sense of who the intended reader is from the cover for from the Planter's Oil cookbook. So, and of course, these ones would be free. I'm not sure about the Manischewitz ones. And of course, the Manischewitz cookbooks now are like huge, big, fancy ones with color illustrations and very contemporary dishes. They're another whole story. So I think with that, I'll stop. And we've got time. I think we have, if I'm not mistaken, we have until 11:15, 12. We have a half an hour for questions and for conversations. So let me have a look in the chat and see what we've
Barbara,
got. Yeah.
I have on, thank you for that. I have on my end that this goes until 12:30. I'm happy to continue the Zoom afterwards.
So what is it? What time is it now?
It's 12:15.
Oh, it's 12:15 now. Okay, so do we have 15 minutes?
Yeah. Definitely, but I'm saying if you need to take a little longer, I can keep the Zoom open.
Oh, okay, great, thanks.
Sure.
Okay, so maybe what we'll do is, how about we open up the mics, and if people will, and I'll turn on the gallery view so I can see you all. Let's turn on. Oh, great! Let's turn on the videos. Let's turn on the mics, and I can, of course, go through the chat. But I wonder if maybe what we should do is this: just either raise your hand. I think there's a way to do it, or just raise your hand. Period. If you okay, so raise your hand if you have any sort of questions, comments. Well, first of all, let me ask you a couple of questions. Do any of you collect cookbooks, and do any of you collect Jewish cookbooks? And is there something you'd like to share with us about your collection? Let me start with that. So who do I have? Let's see if I can.
So I see Shira. Let's have Shira go.
Okay, go.
I'm putting myself on camera.
Okay, Shira, do you want to say something? Is your mic unmiked? Your mic on? Okay, we got
it.
Shira,
Okay.
Miriam.
So my most precious Jewish cookbook is in English, and it's a B'nai B'rith cookbook from Brighton Beach in the early 50s. And my mother, who was, as she would say, a lousy cook, the saying was lousy food, just like mother used to make in my household. And so she had copious notes, and she has a handwritten recipe for challah that she learned from the DP women in our little farm community in New Jersey.
Wow. And was she a lousy cook, or was that just?
She was such a wretched cook that I learned to cook from cookbooks in self-defense.
Wow.
She was really a terrible cook. Her big advice to me was, if you take a can of tomato soup and heat it in one pot and a can of pea soup in another pot, and you pour them simultaneously into the soup bowl, people will be wowed.
Holy cow, I have to try it.
Yeah, it's amazing. On the other hand, she made a great golden ayoyach. That was the one thing she could do.
Wow. So that is definitely a treasure that you want to hang on to. That is definitely a treasure.
I would imagine that there are all sorts of Hadassah, B'nai B'rith.
Oh yes, no, there are thousands. I mean, really, the biggest section of my collection are charity cookbooks. Mm-hmm. And I think they're fascinating. It's not about whether the recipes are good or bad. It's what they tell you about the communities that made them.
Well, these recipes are great. It's still my blinzer recipe today.
Yeah. And some of them are really, really good. Really good. So Miriam, did I see, is it Mimi?
So Shira, I'm muting you, and who would like to go next? If you just raise your hand. I see Isabel.
Yeah.
That was an absolutely fascinating talk. I tried to multitask and to take a few notes, but I was late because I wanted also to picture you while you were showing the books. So thank you, Barbara. That is so, it's opening doors and windows for me. I'm not a compulsive collectioner because I moved internationally a few times and I could not gather all my stuff together, but I'm fascinated by the cultural and anthropological information that these books conveys. I'm a very, how do you say, lousy, affoilemoise when it comes to cooking. So I go maybe to the most practical, but I spend a lot of time in the kitchen. Cookbooks are, for me, more cooking and cookbooks are a little bit separated.
Understood. Well, on tomorrow, also at 11, if I'm not mistaken, Fekele Jacobs and I are going to do a session called Memories from the Yiddish Kitchen. And we're hoping that people will come to that session and either ahead of time or bring with them recipes and memories of what they identify with or what they think of as from the Yiddish kitchen. And of course, Fekele and I will share our memories. I will share my mother's split pea barley soup. She's apparently an avid baker. Her sister's an avid cook. Mm-hmm. They are definitely a Yiddish family. And I think that'll be a lot of fun. And our hope is if we get enough recipes, at least 10, mm-hmm. We'll make a little 2020 Yiddish New York cookbook, just from the contributions of our participants. We think that would be a lot of fun, and we'll just compile them. Nothing fancy, but I've already got 2. I've got one for Potato Nick and one for Bubba's apple pie or apple cake, I think. So I've got one. So I've already got 3. So the other 7 were good.
Makes me want to add one little thing, is that the recipes handwritten in Yiddish that I found from my mother were in the Russian address book, the little Russian thing that she brought with the addresses when we traveled from Lithuania.
Listen, can you Poland? How many recipes?
3 or 4. I can show it tomorrow.
Can you scan them and send them?
Yes, absolutely.
That would be great. That'd be super. Thank you. Talia. You want to unmute yourself?
I'm muting Talia and I'm muting Isabel.
Okay, thank you.
Talia, I'm asking you to unmute.
Talia, you want to unmute yourself?
Then I'll have David go next.
Talia?
I'm trying to, hold on.
You're unmuted.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I agree. It was absolutely wonderful. I could sit here all day and listen to you.
Talia's muted again. Talia, you want to unmute?
Do you know how to unmute yourself? Hold on, I'm going to try to unmute her. Talia, hold on. I'm trying to ask you to unmute, but do you see?
Talia, can you see how you can unmute yourself? At the bottom left of your Zoom screen, there's a little microphone.
I see it, but it's not happening.
Yeah, you're unmuted now. You're good. You're good. Okay.
Excuse me, please. Yeah, I could sit here and listen to you all day. Absolutely fascinating. I wonder if you're willing to address the whole question of what accounts for the interest in the general Polish non-Jewish audience for Żydowska cooking now in the last few years.
Well, it's an interesting question, because what I would say is, first of all, there are so many affinities between Jewish, what we think of as Jewish and not Jewish. And what's fascinating for me is that it's when, let me put it this way. There are, in many, many ways, what's being cooked in a Polish kitchen and in a Jewish kitchen is exactly the same, with a few small differences, like using goose fat or chicken schmaltz rather than lard, not using pork, but let's say beef, not mixing milk and meat. But otherwise, borscht, cholupchis, kreplach, pierogi, vareniki, blintzes, which is nalosniki. You are looking at a cuisine which, when Polish Jews emigrate, when they come to, let's say, Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, dishes that in Poland would have been indistinguishable from dishes that Poles made, in America, they become identified as Jewish. And you find them in Jewish restaurants, in Jewish delis. They get mass produced, they get put on the shelves in the supermarkets. So there is a way, of course, then there are Polish restaurants and whatnot, but they've never gone mainstream the way in which so-called Jewish food in America has gone mainstream. So that would be one piece of the story. The second, I think, is that it's part of a more general interest in Poland in all things Jewish. And the way that we think about it at POLIN Museum in this post-Holocaust period is we would think of it as small numbers, big presence. In other words, the actual number of Jews that survived the Holocaust, stayed in Poland, and remained in Poland today is really small, absolutely small, never mind percentages. But Jewish presence in Polish consciousness is enormous, and it expresses itself in an interest in music, religion, literature, culture, Jewish studies, historical sites, synagogues, cemeteries, historic preservation. It expresses itself in many, many ways, and food is one of them.
Great, thank you. So we just have a time for
Thank you.
So David is up next. David, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and we just probably have time for one or two more people. Thank you.
Thanks so much. This is really just a great talk. I had a little addendum to chicken schmaltz and other fat oil sources for cooking. Is that I know in Czechoslovakia, or would have been Czechoslovakia, people use white poppy seed oil because they couldn't get access to other oils like olive oil or nut oil before sort of globalization. But my question is, has anyone come across like big collections of recipes in Jewish local newspapers? Like when I was looking through my hometown Jewish newspaper, the Buffalo Jewish Review, every week there was a section of 8 to 10 recipes, and half of it was sort of like awful, something encased in Jello, but half of it was these really great Hamish recipes, Hamish Jewish recipes for an ostensibly immigrant population. I'm just wondering, has someone looked at, did the forwards have the recipe?
Yes. Actually, your question makes me think that there's a doctoral dissertation or a book to be written about Jewish food columnists. And in the Yiddish press, the Polish press in Europe, in the Yiddish press in Europe and here, and in the the Anglo-Jewish press, in the Jewish press in English, it's topic. And the forwards had a food columnist called Regina Frischwasser. And she actually compiled recipes from her food columns in a cookbook, which I own. I should actually have pulled it out. Wow, I have to find it. But in any event, yes, it's a great question, and I don't think anybody has studied it.
Great, thank you. We have time for, I think, one or two more. Is there anyone else? I also have something I'd like to add if no one else. Okay, I see Eve wants to go. Okay.
If I could just add to David, actually there was vegetable oil in the old country and in Poland, and it was largely sunflower seeds, because sunflower seeds were grown on a very, very large scale, and they were a prime source of oil with sunflower seed presses for oil. So it's not as if there was only animal fat. Animal fat was something you could prepare yourself, and it was sort of a way to use the fat from fowl that you bought. But oil was also available.
Great. Okay. So Eve, would you like to go? And then I can add something.
Why do you think Regina Frischwasser's book is in English when the columns that she collected were Yiddish?
I think that's exactly the reason why. I think it was a way to make her Yiddish columns available to the English reader. I think that's what it was.
I have to admit I haven't looked at it, but do you have any idea whether they are translations or improvements, a la Bashevis?
You mean from her English, from her Yiddish columns?
Mm-hmm.
No, it's a good question. It would require, it really would require looking to see whether it's just a straight translation or whether she adapts them for what she assumes an English language reader would need. I think it would be a good, very nice essay, actually.
Yeah.
And if I could just say that Eve has done us a great service by in translating the Vilna, this wonderful vegetarian cookbook by Fania Levando, and hopefully we're gonna try and bring out a second edition because this edition is out of print. But Eve actually translated this entire cookbook, which appeared in the late 1930s, and it's a huge saga and wonderful story about Levanda herself, who had a restaurant, who had a cooking class, who published this cookbook, and all kinds of celebrities came there and signed her guest book. It's like a whole saga. So Eve, I just want to acknowledge that that's a really wonderful contribution.
Thank you very much. She also published some newspaper recipes which have not yet appeared in English, which will be, God willing, be included.
Great.
Okay.
Al, come Tuesday and Wednesday for hands-on demos.
Well, that's right.
Of the recipes.
But Eve's going to be doing two cooking classes in Yiddish.
Af Yiddish, yeah.
Af Yiddish.
Great.
But
then,
easy.
It looks like, do you have time for just one more comment, Barbara, from Bob?
Sure.
All right, Bob, go ahead. I'm asking you to unmute.
One small linguistic comment. You showed a cookbook with the Polish title, Polska Kuchnia Koszerna. That's different from Koszerna Polska Kuchnia. Say Polska Kuchnia Koszerna means Polish versions of kosher foods, and Koszerna Kuchnia Polska would be kosher versions of Polish food.
Oh, good point. That is so weird. How do you account for that?
That's the way the language works.
No, but I mean, for why would the publisher do that?
That's your province, not mine.
Oh, come on. I can't let you off the hook. Speculate.
Well, I mean, you talked about, rightly so, about the interest in everything Jewish these days. I forgot the date of the Polska Kuchnia Koszerna, but it obviously didn't start just yesterday. So this is just Polonizing what people are interested in from Jewish cooking.
So, okay, so just a second. This is Kuchnia Koszerna, so that's just kosher cuisine, kosher cooking. Kuchnia Żydowska,
Yeah.
that's Jewish cuisine. Polska Kuchnia, so this is Polish cuisine that is kosher. Polska Kuchnia Koszerna.
No, Polish versions of kosher cooking.
Polish versions of kosher cooking. Holy cow. Wow. And this one is, isn't that is fascinating. Polish, in other words, it's kosher cooking Polish style, or, Polish versions of kosher cooking. Good to know. Good to know. Thanks, Bob.
Sure. Thanks for your talk. Wonderful.
Great. So we're 1 second. So we're just about ending. Barbara, I just wanted to add personally that I wrote my Jewish thesis in undergrad about the Rear Bakery in Kingston, New York, which is still
Which
functioning.
bakery?
Rear, the
bakery?
Rear Family Bakery in Kingston, New York. And I'm the only secondary source that's been written about them, and it's being turned into a children's book. And we have access to the cookbook from the bakery, which I can send to you if you'd like.
Oh, I would love that. I'd be thrilled to have it. Thank you.
Sure. So I'll email it to you.
That would be great. Thanks. Is it only electronic, or is it hard copy also?
The woman who's working on the manuscript for the children's book has it, so I'll have to get you in touch with her. She's using my source material to write the book, so I'll connect you to.
But did they actually publish a cookbook?
I think it was just in the family's archive. It was never published.
That would be great. Thank you. I'd appreciate it very
And
much.
see Eve too. I'll drop my this is my email, Eve, if you want to email me and do more of that. Great. Is there any last thoughts, or looks like people are getting ready for the concert? Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you. And Eve, I see I'll message you.
Yeah, okay. If you message me, because I can't see it in the chat, so if you message me, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for being here. I hope you'll join us tomorrow, which I think will be a lot of fun, with Vegela Jacobs, and we'll take a different tack, but I think it'll be fun. So come, bring recipes, bring memories. It'll be a big share.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.